Good morning, members of Synod. We come now to item 501, the report of the Revision Committee on the draft Cathedrals measure. You'll need the report of the Revision Committee, which is GS 2136Y, and the draft revised measure itself, GS 2136A. This item also has a financial implication, and you can read about that on notice paper 6. So I now call upon the chair of the Revision Committee, the Dean of Southwark, to move the motion that the Synod do take note of this report. You may speak for no more than 10 minutes.
Andrew Nunn, Dean's 55. Chair, it was recently reported that Britain, with its wonderful castles and coastline and cathedrals, came second in Lonely Planet's recommendations for the best places for people to visit this year. If you're interested in who beat us to the top spot, it was the Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan, which, I have to admit, even the loveliness of Durham Cathedral, perched on its promontory, would find it hard to compete with. Thank you. We all know that our cathedrals are part of the rich heritage of this country, national treasures that we've the privilege of caring for, and day in, day out, opening for the people of England to visit, to worship in, to encounter God in. But friends, we need to be fit for purpose in the 21st century, with robust governance structures, healthy finances, and excellence at every level. It was for this reason that the draft Cathedrals measure received first consideration at the July 2019 group of sessions, following Synod's request in July 2018 for a draft measure to be brought forward to implement those recommendations in the Cathedral Working Group, the CWG report, that require legislative change. The Revision Committee, which was set up after the July Synod and has met on 5 occasions, was aware that each of the 42 cathedrals is different and operates within its own particular local circumstances. Therefore, when considering amendments to the draft measure, the committee sought, where possible, to strike a balance between the need to provide consistency across all cathedrals and the freedom for cathedrals to make the adaptations they need to flourish in their particular situations. We favoured enabling clauses over prescriptive requirements and have sought to keep the legislation as light touch as was practical, using guidance where possible. Finally, we've tried to provide clarity on the separation between the governance role of the chapter and the operation and management roles of clergy and staff. Now, you may well remember that I was less than complimentary about some of the recommendations of the CWG report, and some of what was then included in the draft measure when it first came before us. I now want to wholeheartedly commend the measure to you at this stage of the process, and to thank Eva Arblaze for her amazing work and that of the entire legal team. In the time I have, Chair, I just want to highlight where the principal changes are. These are outlined in the report from page 2 onwards. Firstly, the committee considered that it was important for the draft measure to be clear about the cathedral's central role in the diocese and its role in mission. This is now where the measure begins in clause 1. Secondly, we looked at the proposals around the future of cathedral councils. The committee amended the draft measure to confer a power on chapters to set up an advisory council of stakeholders should they wish to do so. Such an advisory council would not have any statutory functions, but would have those functions conferred on it by the chapter in its statutes, which could include many of the advisory functions currently undertaken by councils. Thirdly, the place of administrators, receiver generals, call them what you will, who are presently members of chapter. The committee agreed with the principle that a paid employee should not be a member of the chapter, so that there is a clear separation between the governance and management roles and functions in the cathedral. However, in recognition that in some cathedrals there is a desire that present post holders retain their position on chapter, transitional provisions have been made. There was a degree of pushback, not least from deans, on the notion of a vice chair of the chapter. The committee decided that the term vice chair was unhelpful, let's say, and so recast it as a senior non-executive member. Although this role includes chairing chapter meetings in the dean's temporary absence, the change of title clarifies that the role is quite distinct from that of the sub-dean where such a position exists. Quite a bit of work was done on the community role that non-parish church cathedrals have, not least in relation to the election of members to deanery synod. So we've amended the draft measure to require all non-parish church cathedrals to maintain a role which lists habitual worshippers. This list would be used to calculate the number of lay representatives on the deanery synod for that cathedral. But there is also provision to allow parish church cathedrals to have a community role as well as an electoral role, if that would be useful. One real area of concern has been around financial reporting, risk and audit, and we thought long and hard about these areas. Although it may be preferable to have a finance committee and a separate audit and risk committee, there's no legal imperative to do so. As some cathedrals may struggle to populate two committees with people of the right caliber and skills, the committee amended the draft measure to leave the decision as to how these functions are covered to individual cathedrals. Another major area of change has been around the role of the bishop in relation to chapter. It's clear that as visitor, they shouldn't attend chapter meetings. And so instead it's proposed that the chapter will be required to hold an annual special chapter meeting, which the bishop is required to attend. With regard to residentiary canons, most of the recommendations will be implemented through guidance. However, the committee amended the draft measure to provide clarity as to how residentiary canons will be held accountable to the chapter for their executive non-trustee functions. The draft measure confers an enabling power on the church commissioners to set the financial year-end date for cathedrals. A number of people asked that this power be left out to allow for local flexibility. However, we considered that this enabling power should be retained, as although the church commissioners have no current plans to exercise this power, it was felt prudent to retain it so that it can be exercised should it be needed in the future. One important area that we had to look at was removal of clergy from office. Clause 40 of the draft measure was quite wide-ranging, including in its ambit non-cathedral clergy. Following discussions with the Charity Commission, this clause has been amended so that it only refers to cathedral clergy, as the committee considered that a separate measure should provide for the removal and suspension of non-cathedral clergy. There's also clarification about how suspension and removal operate in relation to charity law. Finally, the draft measure has been considerably amended to provide for its staged implementation, as requested by the Charity Commission, and for the provisions of the draft measure to come in force cathedral by cathedral. But there is one important date in that all chapters will have to have completed the process by the 31st of March 2023. Now, if I've tempted you with the thoughts of a visit to Bhutan, I want to instead encourage you to visit your cathedrals, because we've got a year of pilgrimage this year. And we have a special passport for you to enable you to get stamps in your passport as you travel around all the cathedrals. You can buy one from your nearest cathedral bishops, and then you can travel to somebody else's cathedral and see exactly what it's like, and the rest of us can do the same. So get your pilgrim passport. Ignore the advice of those travel companies. Don't go to Bhutan this year. Instead, go and visit your local cathedrals. They are gems that we're very fortunate to have. Chair, I look forward to hearing Synod's views, but as I said earlier, I have no hesitation as a dean in commending this revised draft measure to the Church and move that the Synod do take note of this report.
The matter is now open for debate. I remind members that under Standing Order 57, it's not in order to debate a matter which is a subject of an amendment on the order paper. Yes. Yes, please. Are you Margaret, is that right?
Margaret Sheether, Gloucester 315. Thank you, Chair, for calling me, and I speak as a member of the chapter of Gloucester Cathedral. Since our debate on this measure in July, the great sacred spaces of our cathedrals have been very much in the news, with the summer of golf and helter-skelters, and with the continuing extraordinary impact of the Museum of Moon exhibition as it continued its journey around the country. Chichester Cathedral even got a mention on the news quiz last Friday. See me afterwards if you missed it. At Gloucester Cathedral, the upward trend in Christmas attendance continued, as I imagine it did in many others. And all the while, the daily cycle of worship, prayer, and welcome has continued. It feels very important, therefore, as the Dean of Southwark has already said, that the governance and working practices of these places should match what they achieve in this lively range of ways, and be robust enough to enable their continuing challenges to be faced and negotiated successfully. So in Gloucester, we welcome this measure and all that it seeks to put in place for cathedrals' current and future life. It's clear that thoughtful and careful work has gone in the revision group to bring the revised measure back to us, and we want to thank them very much for that, and also to thank those who've done the similar, very careful work to develop the intended relationship with the Charity Commission. The result addresses skillfully many of the concerns that were raised in the earlier discussions, and it's clear that all the points that were put to the revision and steering groups have been thoughtfully addressed. As has already been said, there's a tremendous variation in the life and work of cathedrals across the country, and it's good to see those variable starting points now being reflected in the balance of the measure and the items that are going to then be included in guidance. I do hope that we're going to see the resources that are put aside, and it's good to see in the finance statement that those have been identified, really ready with practical support at the time when the cathedrals that need them need to start to make use of them. The availability of legal advice is particularly welcome. We also welcome the light touch of the measure and the extensive use of the guidance to allow for the creative variation that exists. We can offer some experience from Gloucester, I think, as some departures from key roles several years ago could have been a crisis for us. But thanks to joint work with the diocese, the chapter was able to identify the serious changes that were necessary to put the operation on a firm and sustainable footing. The work to deliver those changes is now well advanced, including new lay appointments to chapter to strengthen the expertise and oversight in the way the measure seeks to achieve. The process of change inevitably continues as new initiatives throw up new needs. There have been some tough times to be negotiated, and finance is always a challenge, as in other places. But we can say to others who may be concerned about what the changes might demand of them or what the disturbance to their lives and operations might be, that facing the issues and making the most of the opportunities that they do offer can be a really good and successful process. In that process, relationships, both internal and external, will still be key both to achieving the transition, which is not a minor one, as well as to the effective functioning of the new structures in the future. It doesn't matter how good the governance structures are, how excellent the reporting is, if people aren't working hard on constructive relationships, and that continues to need to be the context for all of these changes. The saying goes that you should never waste a good crisis, and that proved true for us in Gloucester, and I'm sure it can prove true as we work from the crisis that prompted the original working group report to develop into this measure and to see it implemented. I think it will be clearly a catalyst for important development that I hope will now receive wide support. Thank you.
Yes, yes, please.
Debbie Flack, Europe 113. Thank you, Chair, for calling me. We in the Diocese in Europe warmly welcome this draft cathedrals measure. And although we are not perhaps as attractive as Bhutan, I can offer you, O Dean of Southwark, an invitation to meet our newly appointed Dean in Gibraltar, not bad, or a visit to one of our two pro-cathedrals, either in Brussels or in Malta. So do consider this on your very nice, smart blue passport. And I commend this measure for your approval. Thank you.
I see no one standing, so I call upon the Dean of Southwark to reply to the debate.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to Margaret and Debbie for their contributions, and I'm looking forward to taking up the opportunity then to go to Gibraltar. I have been there, I've been to that cathedral, I'll go again. Malta, yes, lovely place. I've been to that pro-cathedral, so I'm happy to go again if you're paying. And the blue passport, well, we're very grateful to those who have designed it, and the Archbishop did notice that little fact when I handed it over to him, so I hope that you will use it, though. Margaret, yes, thank you so much for mentioning some of the resources and support that will be available to cathedrals in order to do this rather important piece of work, very important piece of work in actually transferring what's in the measure into the life of cathedrals. And there is going to be support, guidance, templates for us to work through, and there will be a background advice as well in order that we can do that well and do it speedily. And so there will be various tranches of cathedrals going through final registration with the Charity Commission to enable them to deal with all that work. So thank you for highlighting the importance of that, but also, I think, the importance of relationships within cathedrals. That is really what is at the foundation of everything. You can't legislate for relationships. Those things have to be built together as we do the tasks that we're given to do in our wonderful cathedrals. And I began by saying how important our cathedrals are, not just in the life of the church, but in the life of the nation. All who are involved in the governance of our cathedrals, staff and volunteers, need to be thanked for the amazing job that they do. This new measure will help us to be even more fit for purpose, and so I commend it to you again for the next stage of the revision process, and thank again the members of the revision committee with whom I've served and the legal team for the amazing work that they have done. Thank you.
So we now put item 501, that the Synod do take note of this report, to the vote. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. And all those against? That is quite clearly carried. So we now come to the revision stage for the draft measure. Amendments and other motions appear on the order paper for today. Where no notice has been given of any amendments to particular clauses and no members have indicated they wish to speak against those clauses, I've given my permission under Standing Order 58 to the clauses being taken en bloc. As this is the revision stage, we will also have to use the 40-member procedure under Standing Order 59. Where an amendment is moved by someone other than a member of the steering committee and is not simply consequential on an amendment that has already been passed, the mover has no more than 5 minutes to speak to it. I will then call a member of the steering committee to speak for no more than 5 minutes in reply. If the steering committee does not support the amendment will lapse unless 40 members stand in their places, or if unable to do so, indicate that they wish the debate to continue or a vote to be taken. So we begin with clause 1, which is item 510, and I ask Adrian Greenwood to move his amendment. You may speak for no more than 5 minutes.
Southwark 411. I'm an honorary lay canon of Southwark Cathedral and was from 2012 to 2016 the Bishop of Southwark's lay appointee on the chapter of Southwark Cathedral. I am the current lay chair of Southwark Diocesan Synod, and I'm also a member of Archbishop's Council who commissioned the original report. This very simple one-word amendment, simple but I hope significant, and I hope that the Synod will support it. The opportunity to legislate for the governance of cathedrals only comes around once in a generation, so we need to get it as right and as fit for purpose as possible. Those of you who have read the report of the Revision Committee, GS 2136Y, will know that I stressed concern that the cathedral's measure failed adequately to address the relationship between the cathedral and the diocese. So I am very grateful indeed that the Revision Committee has introduced new clause 1B, as emphasised by the Dean, so that now the clause reads, a person on whom a function is conferred by or under this measure must, in exercising that function, have due regard to B, the importance of each cathedral's role in providing a focus for the life and work of the Church of England in the diocese. Thank you very much. A very clear commitment in the opening clause that underpins the whole measure. So why am I, like Oliver Twist, coming back for more? Well, I hope you would all agree that the promotion of reconciliation and unity in Christ is central to the good news of the kingdom of God and to the church of which Jesus Christ is the head. John 17, verse 20 and 21 reads in the NIV, "My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message," that's us, "that all of them may be one. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me." So not only a prayer for unity, but unity with a purpose, that is, that the world may believe. Jesus said something very similar after washing his disciples' feet in John 13. "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so must you love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples." St. Paul combined the themes of unity and love in his letter to the Philippians, chapter 2. "Therefore, if any of you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in his spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and one in mind." Building on these foundations, Anglican ecclesiology sees the bishops as the focus of unity and mission in their diocese. And of course, the cathedral is where the seat of the diocesan bishop is located. It is noteworthy to me, and no doubt deliberate by the revision committee, that new clause 1b uses the word focus. At the start of this new decade, so much of our national and global society has experienced division or divisions, which extend, unfortunately, into our beloved church. Who will lead us forward in reconciliation and unity? Fortunately, our wonderful Archbishop Justin is setting a great example. So, Synod, we have a special opportunity here to support him through the cathedral's measure, to enable and encourage our bishops and cathedrals to be that focus for unity in Christ, for our diocese, for unity in the Church of England, for unity between cathedral, bishop and diocese in the mission of God. Please support this amendment so that subclause B would read, "The importance of each cathedral's role in providing a focus for the life, work and unity of the Church of England in the diocese." I beg to move. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I call upon a member of the steering committee to speak for no more than 5 minutes in reply.
Thank you, Chairman. Canon Robert Hammond, Chelmsford 273, Chair of the Steering Committee. The Steering Committee has sympathy with Mr. Greenwood's amendment, but we don't believe that it adds anything to the legislation. Indeed, it may actually confuse it and make it less clear. Law should be clear, and this amendment can be open to different interpretations as to what unity means, and indeed, does that include reconciliation? The Steering Committee considers that opening up the potential for disagreements over what unity means in this context could have the opposite effect to that which Adrian intends. In addition, there is a real concern that imposing such a duty could be used to undermine the independence of a cathedral and its chapter. As such, the Steering Committee resists this amendment.
Thank you. So the steering committee do not support the amendment. So it will lapse unless 40 members stand in their places or indicate in some other way their wish for debate on this amendment to continue. Are there 40 members? There are not 40 members standing in their place. So the amendment lapses, and so we need to put 510 to the vote. No, sorry, 511. So we need to put 511 to the vote. So could we, sorry, let's have a member of the steering committee to come move item 511.
Robert Hammond, Chelmsford 273. I move that clause 1 stands part of the measure.
Is there any debate on 511? Tim Hind, the speech limit is 3 minutes.
Tim Hind, 247 Bath and Wells. Just having listened to Robert Hammond just there, talking about clarity and trying to put 2 and 2 together, I note that in the ICSA report that we will be seeing later this week, there has been criticism over the clarity that the words due regard give, and just wonder whether or not there is something that can be done. I won't oppose this particular motion at the moment, but I think we ought to consider whether or not due regard is the right sort of thing to have in our legislation going forward.
I see no one standing, so could a member of the steering committee reply to the debate on 511?
Robert Hammond, 273 Chelmsford. I understand there is some work being done, including with ICSA, on understanding exactly what due regard means, and due regard is the legal phrase that is normally used in this context. So we would propose staying with that.
Thank you. So let's put 511 to the vote. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. All those against? That is quite clearly carried. So we now move on to item 512. So could I have a member of the steering committee to move that clauses 2 to 5 stand part of the measure?
Robert Hammond, Chelmsford 273. Do I need to say that each time, Chair?
Pardon?
Do I need to say who I am every time?
Probably.
Probably. In which case, you will certainly know who I am by the end of today. Robert Hammond, Chelmsford 273. I move that clause 2 to 5 stands part of the measure.
I see no one standing, in which case we put 512 to the vote. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. All those against? That has been quite clearly carried. We now come to item 513, which involves the assertion of a new clause 5A. So can I invite Carl Hughes to move his amendment, item 513, and you may speak up to 5 minutes.
413 Southwark. Thank you, Chairman. I hadn't quite realised I was going to be part of such a Southwark tag team on the Cathedrals measure this morning. Over the past 4 years, I've been blessed with the opportunity to immerse myself in the details of how our great cathedrals are run, managed and governed. Firstly, when I was asked to undertake an initial review of the financial condition of Peterborough Cathedral in 2016, thereafter leading a small team which worked with Bishop Donald on his formal visitation of the cathedral. Secondly, through serving on the cathedral's working group. And thirdly, most recently, by serving on the cathedral's measure revision committee. The draft measure that is before us today has been significantly enhanced and refined during the revision process, with input from members of Synod, cathedral communities and the Charity Commission. This measure will assist in aligning cathedrals with current best practice in terms of charitable management and governance. However, there is one area of the measure which has given me cause for concern, and hence my decision to propose this amendment concerning cathedrals' community roles. I would just like to say in passing that I am enormously grateful for the considerable assistance from Eva and the legal office in helping me to draft this amendment. In the latter stages of the Revision Committee's deliberations, the Dean of St Paul's made a very helpful intervention, drawing the committee's attention to his concern that the provisions of the original measure, when combined with the church representation rules, enable those who are not habitual worshippers to be represented in the governance structures of the Church of England, for example, on elections to deanery synods. This matter was addressed by the Revision Committee through the revisions to paragraph 3 in Schedule 1. For parish church cathedrals, the electors for deanery synod representatives are those whose names are on the electoral roll of the parish. However, for non-parish church cathedrals, the electors for deanery synod representatives are persons aged over 16 whom the dean has declared to be habitual worshippers. This reflects the historical practice of royal peculiars and is clearly at variance with parish church cathedrals and all other Church of England parishes. It's not apparent to me why the qualifications to be on the roll for non-parish church cathedrals should be different from those for parish church cathedrals and all other parishes, i.e. the roll should comprise those who are baptised, aged 16 or over, members of the Church of England or a church in communion with it, and have habitually attended public worship at the cathedral during the preceding 6 months. The new clause 5A set out in my amendment thus aligns the roles of non-parish church cathedrals with parish church cathedrals and parishes more generally, while still enabling all cathedrals to maintain a wider community role for, amongst other things, the election of non-executive chapter members. This latter option also aligns cathedrals with parish churches, where the electorate for church wardens is broader than simply the electoral roll of the parish. In addition, I believe that the new clause 5A is much clearer than paragraph 3, subparagraphs 2 to 4 in Schedule 1 as currently drafted. Synod, I very much hope that you will agree that it would be appropriate for the rolls of non-parish church cathedrals to be prepared on the same basis as is used across the rest of the church, other than by the royal peculiars, particularly as the people on these rolls are the electorate for non-parish church cathedral deanery synod representatives. Accordingly, I beg to move this amendment.
So could we have a member of the steering committee to reply?
Robert Hammond, Chelmsford 273. The steering committee accepts this amendment from Carl Hughes and the necessary consequential amendments. This is because instead of aligning the non-parish church cathedrals with the royal peculiars in relation to their deanery synod representation, being habitual worshippers, it would align them with the parishes, including parish church cathedrals, by reflecting the provisions of the church representation rules for being on a parish electoral roll. This amendment is accepted as the electorate who elect a small number of the non-executive chapter members in those cathedrals which want to have such elected members will still be on those wider cathedral community rolls. This reflects the position for PCCs, where those in the parish who are not on the PCC's electoral roll are able to vote in the election of church wardens who are also members of the PCC. But to be absolutely clear, whether or not Synod decides to carry this amendment, paragraph 2.7 of Schedule 1 states that only a person who is a member of the Church of England, a church in communion with it, or one subscribing to the doctrine of the Holy Trinity is eligible to be a non-executive chapter member.
So the steering committee accept the amendment. The matter is open for debate. Speech limit is 3 minutes.
Luke Miller, 162 London. I very much welcome this, but there's one small detail that I think that we should look at, and it's about starting things. If you look at 2C, then in order to be on the roll, you have, as we well understand, to have been habitually worshipping for 6 months, and the problem comes at the beginning of the existence of a new cathedral. Now, we might not be expecting to open new cathedrals, but maybe we will, but we have actually come across this in precisely the point when we open new parishes. When a BMO church has turned itself into a parish, we ran into precisely this problem, and for 6 months we couldn't populate the PCC. And so at some point it would be very useful if the lawyers could look into how, for the first 6 months of the existence of a new institution, it would be possible for there to be some way of defining roll membership in order that you can then populate the governance body.
Nick Baines, Bishop of Leeds, 22. I'm a bit embarrassed to ask this, but is there a definition anywhere of a member of the Church of England? I remember a bishop saying to me about 20 years ago that if you think you're a member of the Church of England, you probably are. But does it mean those who are baptised and confirmed? Does it mean those who are on the electoral roll? Does it mean, who does it mean? Now, I might be missing something. There is a perfectly good definition in the church rep rules, but I don't know it. And just as an aside, I would beg your patience, because I have 3 cathedrals, and so every provision we make, I do in triplicate. Thank you.
I see no one standing. So therefore, we put item 513 to the vote, that the clause be generally approved. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. And those against? That is quite clearly carried. So now I call upon a member of the steering committee to move that item 514, that this clause be inserted in the measure.
Robert Hammond, 273. I move the clause be inserted in the measure.
Let's move to the vote on 514. All those in favour? Thank you. All those against? That is quite clearly carried. So now we move to item 515. That clauses 6 to 9 stand part of the measure.
Robert Hammond, Chelmsford, 273. I move that clauses 6 to 9 stands part of the measure.
I see no one standing, so we put that to the vote. All those in favour? Thank you. All those against? Thank you. That is quite clearly carried. So we now come to item 516, which is Dr. Michael Todd's amendment to clause 10. And so I invite him to move his amendment. You may speak for no more than 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I wish to move an amendment to section 10, which will add to the opening statement 1 that the chapter must direct and oversee the administration of the affairs of the cathedral and its finances. There's no truth in the rumour that I'm moving this amendment simply to prove that there are cathedrals other than Southwark, or indeed that the Diocese of Cornwall competes with Bhutan as a place to take your new blue passport. But instead, I've tabled this amendment very much at the inspiration and instigation of Truro Chapter. And I should mention that whilst I'm the lay chair of the Diocesan Synod, I have no role in the Truro Cathedral. Although finances are mentioned a number of times in the draft measure, and in particular at 10.1c and 10.1d. Neither of these impose a general requirement, such as a regular receipt of management accounts or cash flow projections. A chapter could fulfill its specified duties just with an annual budget and signed off accounts. And in case you think that this is an unreal fear, it's only a small number of years that our diocesan finances were reported only annually to the Bishop's Council and to the Board of Finance. The introduction of monthly reporting, which I sought when, for a time, I became chair of the Board of Finance, was thought by some to be an impossible ask. And we're all aware that cathedrals are becoming ever more complex operations, and in today's climate, such regular scrutiny is considered a minimum fulfillment of trustee responsibilities. So I ask you not to be unduly pedantic in saying either that the amendment is too brief, nor is it really necessary. But I ask you instead to respond positively to Truro Chapter's desire to reinforce the formal financial responsibilities. The chapter is not only to be responsible for what happens in the cathedral, but how it is to be resourced, and keeping the two in balance. So I happily move the amendment standing in my name.
And a member of the steering committee to reply.
Robert Hammond, Chelmsford 273, clause 10.1 of the draft measure sets out the particular duties that the term affairs relates to, which includes preparing the annual budget for the chapter and the annual accounts for audit and subsequent approval. In terms of reference for any finance committee will be in the guidance as well. The steering committee feel that this fully covers financial matters, and in the spirit of wanting to keep the legislation as clear and simple as possible, would resist this amendment as not being necessary.
Synod, you've heard that the steering committee do not support the amendment, and so it will lapse unless there are 40 members who stand or indicate in some other way that they wish the item to continue to be debated. Are there 40 members? There are not, so that lapses. So I ask a member of the steering committee to move item 517, that clause 10 as amended stand part of the measure.
I will move that Robert Hammond, Chelmsford 273, that clause 10 as unamended.
Unamended, thank you.
Stands part of the measure.
The matter is open for debate. I see no one standing. So we put item 517 to the vote. All those in favour? Thank you. All those against? Thank you. That is quite clearly carried. So can we move on to item 518 and a member of the steering committee to move this item?
I move that clause 11 to 40 stands part of the measure.
This matter is open for debate. I see no one standing. So we put item 518 to the vote. All those in favour? Thank you. All those against? That has quite clearly been carried. We now come to an amendment to be proposed by the steering committee to clause 41. And so I ask a member of the steering committee to move the first amendment to clause 41, which is item 519.
Robert Hammond, Chelmsford 273. The Charity Commission has been clear in its expectation that, Should it need to exercise its statutory powers to remove or suspend any dean or residentiary canon as a charity trustee, the draft measure should provide for them to be removed from their ecclesiastical office in the cathedral too. Clause 41 sets out how a dean or residentiary canon would be removed or suspended from ecclesiastical office by the bishop in such a situation. It's been drawn to the attention of the steering committee that there are a very small number of residentiary canons who still hold the freehold office. This means that there are likely to still be some freehold office holders in cathedrals when the charity provisions of the draft measure start to come into force for the first cathedrals in 18 months to 2 years' time. Therefore, Clause 41 needs to be widened so that the power to remove and suspend a dean or residentiary canon on common tenure applies in the same way to a dean or residentiary canon who holds a freehold office. This is a charity commissioning expectation. To be absolutely clear, the proposed power will only relate to a dean or residentiary canon continuing to hold freehold office. The steering committee is therefore proposing 3 amendments to clause 41 to enable the suspension or removal by a bishop of any deans or residentiary canons who hold the freehold office.
The matter is now open for debate. I see no one standing, so we therefore move to a vote on item 519. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. All those against? That has quite clearly been carried. We now come to an amendment to be proposed by the steering committee to clause 41, which is item 520. So I call upon a member of the steering committee to move this second amendment.
Move the second amendment as part of the block of amendments that I just moved and spoke to.
The matter is now open for debate. I see no one standing, so we put item 520 to the vote. All those in favour? Thank you. All those against? That has quite clearly been carried. We now come to an amendment to be proposed by the steering committee to clause 41 under item 521. So would they please move this third amendment?
I move the third amendment.
The matter is now open for debate. I see no one standing. Therefore, we put item 521 to the vote. All those in favour? Thank you. All those against? Thank you. That's quite clearly carried. I now call upon a member of the steering committee to move item 522, that clause 41 stands part of the measure.
I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you who I was last time, didn't I? Robert Hammond, Chelmsford 273. I move that clause 41 as amended stands part of the measure.
I see no one standing. Therefore, we put this item 522 to the vote. All those in favour? Thank you. All those against? That has quite clearly been carried. I now call upon a member of the steering committee to move item 523, that clauses 42 to 52 stand part of the measure.
Robert Hammond, Chelmsford 273. I move that clauses 42 to 52 stand part of the measure.
The matter is now open for debate. I see no one standing. So therefore, we put this item to the vote. All those in favour of item 523? Thank you. All those against? That has quite clearly been carried. We now come to item 524, an amendment proposed by the steering committee to paragraph 1 of Schedule 1. So please can they move this item?
Robert Hammond, Chelmsford 273. I move this amendment. The revision committee considered what should be the factor which determines whether a residentiary canon is an executive or a non-executive chapter member. The decision reached was that it should depend on a residentiary canon's role in the cathedral rather than on whether they're remunerated for undertaking it. This means that a residentiary canon who has operational responsibilities and management functions in the cathedral is an executive chapter member, whether they are self-supporting minister, a house for duty minister, or if their stipend is paid in whole or in part by a third party, for example, the diocese or another charity. Therefore, the definition of an executive chapter member in paragraph 12b of Schedule 1 of the draft measure was amended to refer to a residentiary canon who carries out cathedral duties. The term cathedral duties is defined in clause 44 as meaning duties, whether in the chapter or in the diocese, which should, in the opinion of the chapter, after consultation with the bishop, be performed in or from the cathedral. As this definition is also in the 1999 measure, it's felt to be a well-understood concept for chapters to apply. It was therefore anticipated that, in the few cases where there may be uncertainty as to whether a person carried out cathedral duties for these purposes, the bishop, as visitor, would exercise their visitor's power in clause 9.2 to determine the matter. However, the cathedral duties test, as currently set out in the draft measure, does not enable chapters to determine where a residentiary canon has only occasional cathedral duties of a minor nature, that such cathedral duties are below a materialities threshold. As such, it's been drawn to the steering committee's attention that some residentiary canons may be considered to be an executive chapter member, even though they only carry out very occasional cathedral duties of a minor nature. Therefore, the steering committee proposes that a further clause is added, which A, enables the chapter to determine whether the cathedral duties of any residential canon are of such minor nature that they should be disregarded for these purposes, and B, provides that if there is a dispute on the issue, the bishop, as visitor, has the power to determine the question. Guidance will need to be produced on what may be considered to be the duties of a minor canon minor nature for these purposes.
So item 524 is open for debate. I see no one standing. Therefore, we can move to a vote on item 524. All those in favour? Thank you. All those against? That is quite clearly carried. So we now come to Mr. Hughes' amendment at item 525. This is a consequential amendment to items 513 and 514, which we carried earlier on in the debate. So the 40-member rule does not apply. So I invite Mr. Hughes to move your amendment to paragraph 3 of Schedule 1.
I move the amendment at item 525.
Thank you very much. So item 525 is open for debate. I see no one standing, therefore let's put item 525 to the vote. All those in favour? Thank you. All those against? That is quite clearly carried. So now we come to the Dean of St. Paul's amendment to paragraph 5 of Schedule 1. And this is item 526. So I invite the Dean of St. Paul's to move his amendment. You can speak for no more than 5 minutes.
Thank you. David Ison, Deans 54. The Deans, as the Dean of Southwark said, are very supportive of the measure and its careful balancing of powers and accountability in setting out the roles of chapter, the bishop, and the regulators being the church commissioners and the charity commission. And a key part of the recommendations was that chapter would appoint all but one of its own non-executive members, but the bishop should appoint one non-executive member after consulting the chapter, the post initially called vice chair, but now with the longer descriptor of the senior non-executive member. I hope people enjoy being called SNEMs in future. This is a full member of chapter who could, in a worst-case scenario, convene the non-executive members of chapter to hold chapter's executive members to account. It is, however, for chapter members to hold the executives of chapter to account. And the senior non-executive member does that as a chapter member, not as the bishop's appointee. And it's also important that the senior non-executive member shouldn't be too closely associated with the bishop, not only because the bishop needs to preserve his or her role as an independent visitor should a situation require it, but also because the senior non-executive member, as a charity trustee, needs to be accountable to chapter and not to the bishop. And it's important that the SNEM is not perceived as having a potential conflict of interest or loyalty in exercising that role. At their recent meeting, the deans identified a possible upset of this careful balance that could occur if a member of the bishop's staff were to be appointed by the bishop as the senior non-executive member. It is possible for one or two ordained non-executive members to be appointed to the chapter. And having a suffragan bishop, an archdeacon, or a diocesan secretary appointed as the senior non-executive member would potentially undermine the role of the dean in chapter and certainly make the dean's relationship with the bishop's senior staff more difficult. Accordingly, this amendment is brought forward following advice from the legal office on the wording to disallow the appointment of bishop's senior staff to this role. It refers to the specific roles because there's no single definition in law of what constitutes the membership of a bishop's senior staff. The intention of the amendment is positive rather than negative, in aiming to preserve the clarity in the proposed measure regarding the respective roles of bishop, chapter, and its non-executive members, and I commend it to you on behalf of the deans. I beg to move.
And a member of the steering committee to speak and reply, please.
Robert Hammond, Chancellor 273. The steering committee is grateful to the Dean of St Paul's for this amendment. The steering committee sees merit in the senior non-executive member of chapter not being one of the senior clergy in the diocese or the diocesan secretary, so we are happy to accept Dean Eison's amendment.
So the steering committee accept that amendment. The matter is now open for debate. I see no one standing, so we can put item 526 to the vote. All those in favour? Thank you. And all those against? That has clearly been carried. We now come to item 527, an amendment proposed by the steering committee to paragraph 5 of Schedule 1. So a member to move, please.
Robert Hammond, Chancellor 273. Now, Synod, please bear with me on this one. Deep breath. Paragraph 52B of Schedule 1 prevents the senior non-executive member from having any other role or function in a cathedral. The question was raised as to whether this would prevent the senior non-executive member from chairing chapter committees, which was not the intention of this clause. Paragraph 3.4 of Schedule 1 of the first consideration version of the draft measure sought to make clear the separation between the governance and management roles in cathedrals. Paragraph 5.2b sought to make this clear in relation to the role of the senior non-executive member by clarifying that they could have any other role or function in relation to the cathedral. However, it was not the intention to limit the role or function of the senior non-executive member in their capacity as a charity trustee. The Charity Commission raised concerns to the Revision Committee that paragraph 3.4 of the first consideration version of the draft measure could be understood as purporting to restrict the role and/or discretion of non-executive chapter members as charity trustees in a way which does not accord to the Charities Act of 2011. This is because the executive powers exercised by the executives and employees of a charity are delegated to them by the trustees, and therefore the non-executive chapter members cannot be restricted in law from exercising such powers. Whilst the Charity Commission was supportive of what paragraph 3.4 sought to achieve, being the separation between governance and management functions in the cathedral, the Charity Commission considered that this should be achieved in guidance rather than in the measure. Therefore, the Revision Committee agreed to leave out paragraph 3.4. As it now appears that paragraph 5.2b could be understood in a way that could restrict the senior non-executive member from exercising their trustee powers, which would raise the same concerns that the Charity Commission raised in relation to the original paragraph 3.4 before it was removed, the Steering Committee proposes that current paragraph 5.2b of Schedule 1 is also left out of the measure. The Steering Committee notes that as paragraph 4.3 of Schedule 1 prevents the senior non-executive member from receiving any remuneration from the cathedral, removing paragraph 5.2b would not result in the senior non-executive member being able to undertake any paid executive role in the cathedral. So as new paragraph 5.3 of Schedule 1 was introduced to clarify paragraph 5.2b, the proposed amendment is to remove both paragraph 5.2b and paragraph 5.3, as without paragraph 5.2b, paragraph 3 serves absolutely no purpose. I hope that's clear.
Point of order.
Could we restrict voting on that to those who understood that speech?
I'm afraid, Archbishop, that's not a point of order. However, the matter is now open for debate. No one dares, do they? I see no one standing, so we put item 527 to the vote. All those in favour? Thank you. And all those against? Thank you. That has quite clearly been carried. So we now move to item 528, and I call upon a member of the Steering Committee to move it.
Robert Hammond, Chelmsford 273. I move that Schedule 1, as amended, stands part of the measure.
The matter is now open for debate. I see no one standing, so we now move to a vote on item 528. All those in favour? Thank you. And all those against? That's quite clearly carried. So now we move to item 529, that schedules 2 to 4 stand part of the measure. And I call upon a member of the Steering Committee, Mr. Hammond. How lovely to see you.
Robert Hammond, Chelmsford 273. It's great to be back. I move that schedules 2 to 4 stand part of the measure.
Item 529 is open for debate. I see no one standing, so we move to a vote on item 529. All those in favour? Thank you. All those against? That has quite clearly been carried. So we now come to Mr. Hughes's amendment on item 530, which is another consequential amendment to having carried items 513 and 514. So, Mr. Hughes, please move your amendment.
Carl Hughes, 413 Southwark. I move the amendment at item 530.
Thank you. Item 530 is now open for debate. I see no one standing, so we therefore put item 530 to the vote. All those in favour? Thank you. All those against? That has quite clearly been carried. So now we move to item 531, that Schedule 5 stand part of the measure.
Robert Hammond, Chelmsford 273. I move that Schedule 5 stands part of the measure.
The matter is now open for debate. I see no one standing. So let's put item 531 to the vote. All those in favour? Thank you. All those against? That has quite clearly been carried. So now we come to item 532, that the long title stand part of the measure. And, oh, Mr. Hammond.
I think for the last time, and I'm still Robert Hammond, Chelmsford 273. Just before I do move this, can I thank Synod for your attention for what is some quite complex legislation this morning. And can I, on behalf of the steering committee, thank the legal team, particularly Ava Ablis, for her massive amount of work on this. And can I thank, yeah. Can I thank my Vice Chair, Eve Poole, and the whole steering committee for the massive amount of work that we have done, and the revision committee as well, on this piece of legislation. Bearing that in mind, I move that the long title stand part of the measure.
So this item is open for debate. I would particularly welcome anyone wanting to speak to answer the Bishop of Leeds question about the definition of a member of the Church of England. But whether or not he's going to answer that question, Dr. Harrison.
Jamie Harrison, Durham 299. I think that's beyond my understanding at the moment, and others will no doubt comment on who a member of the Church of England might or might not be. Some of us will remember 1999 in this chamber, where we had a pretty tortuous debate, or serious debates, on the then cathedral's measure. One particular memory from me earlier in that debate was where the Dean of Durham spoke on one side of the debate, to be followed by the Bishop of Durham on the other side of the debate. And indeed, it was that sort of conversation or discussion which was very difficult, and I think, as we've discovered through this process, it was a part-done piece of work. Sometimes we can only do so much, it seems, at one time, before having to come back a bit later and perhaps get it right. Those of us who remember the early debates in this particular set of sessions on this particular measure will remember certain caution and realistic skepticism within the chamber from both deans, members of cathedral chapters, residentiary canons, members of cathedral councils, and so on. And I think it's quite remarkable and wonderful how together the cathedral communities, their leaders, the leaders of dioceses, and particularly the members of Synod who've been involved in this legislation have worked so well together. I certainly want to pay tribute, as many have, to the legal team and to the Revision and Steering Committee, to those who have given so much time and energy. I know Robert particularly, with a very difficult and complex day job, has done a remarkable piece of work, as we heard just now. His humour, his grace, his ability to move things forward in a coherent, even though perhaps some of it was a bit beyond us, coherent way, I think is a wonderful example of Christian service. So I think, as others have done, it's great to pay tribute to that, but also to see how we have moved in 20 years to, I think, a much better place. And the fact there was so little, if you like, difficult debate today reflects the quality and the effectiveness of this piece of legislation. So I want to thank them again, particularly those of us in the House of Laity for whom cathedrals are such an important part of our lives. Thank you.
Peter Collier, Vicar General at Northern Province. My understanding is, in answer to the Chair's question, that there is, either in statute law or in any definitive case law, no definition of a member of the Church of England.
The speech limit is now 2 minutes. Adrian Greenwood.
Adrian Greenwood, Southwark 411. I did actually ask for this matter to be clarified when the measure which introduced the new church representation rules was going through. And I was given the answer that's just been told to us, that there isn't a definition. It's a matter of custom and practice. When I was very young and attended my local parish church in the Diocese of Rochester, there used to be in the porch a little descriptor of the duties of a member of the Church of England, which included attending services, Bible study, prayer, fellowship, giving, and what have you. So even if we can't agree on the definition of who is a member of the Church of England, perhaps we could strive to work out what is expected of such membership. Thank you very much.
The Bishop of Leeds. Strictly speaking, we are only debating now that the long title stand part of the measure. So keep it brief.
Nick Baines, Bishop of Leeds 22, but you did ask the question of definition. This is a serious point. We shouldn't be putting in legislation terms that are not capable of legal definition. And for future reference, I would refer to this.
Members of Synod, I sense we might be getting very excited about something which are actually not supposed to be debating. So Mrs. Derlacher and David Lammy, are you going to, hold on, are you wishing to speak on item 532? The long title stand part of the measure?
Only prompted by your question, which has been the subject of the debate for the last 2 minutes.
Well, forget it, I'm sorry. Synod, I'm going to test your mind on closure on this item. All those in favour of... Thank you. All those against? That is quite clearly carried. So now we put item 532 to the vote. All those in favour? Thank you. All those against? That has quite clearly been carried. That completes the revision stage for the draft cathedrals measure, which now stands committed to the steering committee in respect of the final drafting. Thank you very much, members of Synod. Please do stay in the chamber for the next item, which is term limits on deanery synods.
Synod,
Good morning. I didn't expect to be able to say good morning as we came to this item, but due to the extremely efficient chairing of our previous item, we come to item 6 now, Deanery Synod term limits, for which you will need GS 2154. And so I call on Clive Scowen to move on behalf of the Business Committee. He has up to 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. It's always so good to see a full chamber for these items. Scowen, London 358. This is the first of no fewer than 6 items on this week's agenda, which are what you might call the last fruit of the work of this quinquennium's elections review group, which it has been my privilege to chair. And before I say anything else, I'd like to thank the other members of the group, several of whom are sat behind me, and all the staff who have worked so hard for us, and thank them particularly for all their input and advice. As members will recall, this time last year, during the debate on final approval of the draft church representation and ministers measure, the chair of the Business Committee announced that she had invited the Elections Review Group to undertake a consultation on Rule M85 of the new church representation rules, which has now, from the 1st of January, introduced a 2-term limit for lay members of deanery synods. The group accepted this reference with great joy and decided that it would consult widely on 7 options. And those were, firstly, that the term limit as provided for in Rule M8 be retained. Secondly, to reverse the default position so that there would be no term limit unless the APCM resolved to impose it. Thirdly, increasing the number of consecutive terms which could be served and what that number should be. Fourthly, giving the APCM power to specify what the term limit should be in that particular parish. Fifthly, giving deanery synods power to impose a deanery-wide term limit. Sixthly, giving diocesan synods power to impose a diocesan-wide term limit. And seventhly, reverting to the previous position where there was no power to impose a term limit. In May, the consultation was sent to or disseminated to the members of the General Synod, diocesan secretaries, diocesan and deanery lay chairs, rural deans, PCC secretaries, and the National Deaneries Network. We were overwhelmed by the response. We heard from 391 PCC secretaries, 37 PCC members, 137 lay chairs of deanery synods, 128 members of deanery synods, 46 area and rural deans, 71 members of General Synod, 48 church wardens, 20 members of the National Deanery Network, 5 diocesan secretaries, 17 other clergy, 1 bishop, 6 archdeacons, and 10 lay chairs of diocesan synod. 928 responses in all, including 11 anonymous ones. Maybe a lot more bishops, who knows? We believe this to be the largest response ever received to a national consultation undertaken by the Church. Respondents were given the opportunity to give both quantitative and qualitative responses, the former involving ranking the 7 options in order of preference, which were then analysed using the STV software. Option 1, the term limit imposed by the new Rule M8, was not without support. 207 respondents gave it their first preference. Qualitative responses supporting it contended that terms of office can enable limits on terms of office can enable new members to join. The power of the APCM to disapply would enable the Deanery Synod to manage its local needs. and the introduction of term limits could lead to more diversity of members, including younger members, particularly as there would be an expectation that there would only be a commitment of 3 years. Several respondents noted that this would bring deanery synod lay members in line with the requirements of the church for church wardens, albeit noting that there are different responsibilities for those roles. The most popular option, though, with 286 first preferences, was the previous position where there was no power to impose term limits at all. The most common comment made by respondents was that limited terms of office for deanery synod lay members could lead to some deanery synods not being able to replace retiring members. This was related to the second most common comment, which stated that the efficacy of deanery synods could be undermined by losing experienced members. Several respondents noted that as deanery synods only met 3 times a year, it can be challenging for new members to be able to deliver on their role. Others said that there was a perceived lack of equity with other bodies such as diocesan synods or general synod, where there was no limit on terms of office. It was also noted that since the limit was only applicable to the laity, it could undermine the role of the laity in relation to the clergy. Some raised the question whether this could undermine the work being delivered under the Setting Gods Free programme. It was noted by several respondents that the decision regarding terms of office held by members should be made at the local level, and that a national approach might not reflect the local situation, particularly in rural parishes. 218 gave first preference to reversing the default so that there would be no term limit unless the APCM voted to impose one, and a further 122 favoured leaving it to the APCM to decide how long any limit should be in that parish's case. So, while neither the current Rule M8 nor the previous position was supported by a majority, there was a majority for there being some power to impose a term limit at local level. When STV was applied to the results, the winner was not removing all provision for term limits, but option 2, reversing the default. Now, the personal views on this matter of the members of the Elections Review Group were quite diverse, but all of us agreed that we should do our best to honour what had been said to us in such an impressive set of responses. We felt that that option 2 should be expanded to incorporate option 4, thus giving the APCM power, if it decided to impose a term limit, to specify how many consecutive terms a parochial representative could serve. That is the proposal for which we seek approval in principle today. And unlike the position in Rule M8, the APCM could, if it wished, take into account service prior to the rule coming into effect. So, whereas no one would be affected by Rule M8 until 2026, our proposal would enable APCMs, should they so wish, to agree a limit which would disqualify a member from serving a further term from 2023. If you approve this recommendation today, the Business Committee will bring a Church Representation Rules Amendment resolution to the July group of sessions to give effect to that change. Today, a simple majority will suffice, but in July, a 2/3 majority will be required in each house. For that reason, I would not be unhappy if we were to have a vote by houses today, since if there were no simple majority in each house today, there would be little point in taking up time in July to debate a resolution which was doomed to failure. My hope, though, is that Synod will overwhelmingly approve in all 3 houses this expression of the clear will of the majority of those nearly 1,000 people who responded to the consultation. So I beg to move the motion standing in my name.
Item 6 is now open for debate. There will be a 5-minute speech limit in the first instance, and I call Caroline Herbert, followed by Jane Steen.
Caroline Herbert, Norwich 372. Thank you for calling me Chair. I don't think I need 5 minutes. I just want to welcome the recommendation, and I would urge Synod to vote in favour. Now, some people may find this hard to believe, but there are churches that even now cannot fill all their deanery synod places. And obviously the imposition of a term limit would not make that any easier. In fact, it would mean the faithful few who are committed to serving on a deanery synod would then be prohibited. So I'm really pleased at the possibility that this term limits would be done away with. And I think this will particularly impact on smaller churches, perhaps those in rural areas, where there are a few people faithfully serving and committed to the local church and the deanery, and they'll be able to continue in that. Now, for those churches where there's a queue of people champing at the bit to get onto their local deanery synod, then the proposal for the APCM to be able to set a term limit in specific cases will enable that without disenfranchising the other, perhaps more churches where deanery synod is not such a demand. And let's not forget, it's not just about what happens at those 3 deanery synod meetings, but deanery synod members are the electors for diocesan and general synod posts. So term limits would, again, disenfranchise many of our churches. So, in conclusion, please vote in favour of this motion. Thank you.
Jane Steen, followed by the gentleman right in front of me with the brown jacket. I'm sorry, sir, I don't know your name.
Jane Steen, Southwark 225. Chair, thank you for calling me. Members of Synod will not be at all surprised to hear me speak against this proposed change. We have heard that there are problems with limited terms. People won't have enough time to gain the necessary expertise. Well, if 2 terms are not enough to learn the ropes of a deanery synod, they aren't enough. That would be so whether a PCC must limit terms, or whether an APCM must limit terms, or whether it may limit them. But I remind Synod, the rules as written only require 1 terms of absence. Nobody is being asked to leave the country. Those standing down will be available to mentor new members if that is needed, and perhaps that would be all to the good. The provisions, as we have heard, do not affect deanery synod lay members for many years. Will new people come forward? All the church growth research suggests that having opportunities for new people to take on roles helps them to do so. There is plenty of time for parishes to look at their deaneries, for education, for preparation. If there really is no one else, PCCs can set aside the current rule. And if members cannot be found, then maybe locally or more widely, a long, hard look is needed at the way our deaneries operate. We have had what is by any account a remarkable consultation on this, and our thanks are very much due to those who organised it. It was a consultation, rightly, about the option for limiting terms on deanery synods or not. But the underlying issue here is not only about terms served. It is about the chance to change the culture of the church. We follow a Lord who changes lives, whose church once was said to have turned the world upside down. Might we just give it a go with deaneries? This will not undermine setting God's people free. It might just set a lot of them quite a good deal freer than they feel at the moment. And yes, some will say this only affects the laity. And some will say, and many of us often have said, what about the clergy? Alas, no one suggested that when we wrote the rules. So let's have the laity pioneer it. And if you want to come back to the clergy, it's always an option. Members of Synod, we have debated this long and hard. We searched our hearts and we came to a mind on this. As we believe that God has confidence in his church, so I ask you to have confidence in your earlier decision, resist this attempt to amend the rules, and help us to bring new life, new energy into our deaneries. Thank you.
After Simon Friend, is that right?
Yes.
I call John Mason, and after Simon speaks, the speech limit will move to 3 minutes. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you. Simon Friend, Exeter 310. I would urge Synod to vote against this motion. I went to my second deanery ever and was then elected lay chair of the deanery. There were tears, my tears for realising what had happened after I was elected, and tears of the then lay chair who had been in post for many, many years, and let's say it was awkward. We really do need to bring in a new culture and a fresh approach to deaneries. And there are many, many people who serve faithfully for years, but feel they have to stay on and not allow space for new people to come in and to grow. And I think it's fair to say that the deanery, when I became lay chair, we were able to reinvent it and reimagine it and take it to a new space. But it was difficult and it was painful and it was hard because the people in place felt they needed to stay there. I take the wonderful saying, unless a seed falls into the ground and dies, we cannot bear new fruit. Sometimes we need to allow space. Sometimes we need to allow things to die in order that new fruit can come. So I would urge you to vote against this motion.
After John Mason, I call Martin Kingston.
John Mason, Chester 281. I wish to encourage you very strongly to support this idea. It seems to me it's very obvious, as others have mentioned, that there's a variance in other synodical bodies where there's no term limits, and yet there is one being imposed specifically for deanery synods. I know that church wardens are given term limits, but they are very different. They are sort of executive roles, and they are in positions where prolonged time in that role can have a bearing on a parish in a way which is probably overly, has an over influence. I think the main reason why people, and we've already heard, people wish to have some sort of a term limit is to drive the turnover of the membership of deanery synods. And my observation is simply that if you wish to change culture, if you wish to change behaviours, imposing rules is rarely, if ever, a good way to do it. If what you want is to make deanery synods more lively, get more people involved, what you need to do is make deanery synods themselves more attractive, give them more powers, raise their profile, make it clear that what they do is of value. Otherwise, I think simply to impose a rule which is somewhat arbitrary is just not going to do the job. And it's also, from a very practical point of view, at the parish level, in small parishes, in rural parishes, to be honest, these sorts of minutiae in the rules are not things which are observed that strongly anyway. People will miss it. What we need to do is make deanery synods more attractive. And I think something, reflecting on a little bit, we heard from the Archbishop earlier today in his sermon about the idea that rules and traditions and things can get in the way of human things. And I think that's what's happening here. Let's just forget the idea of getting term rules and just let the natural order of things take over when deanery synods become more attractive. Thank you.
Excuse me. After Martin Kingston, The lady right in front of me, I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Martin Kingston, Gloucester 314. Chair, thank you for calling me. It was Karl Barth who said that faith in God has nothing to do with an ideology which glorifies the status quo. I declare an interest as a member of the simplification group that brought forward the change which you're now trying to change. And you're trying to change it before you've even tried it, before you've given it the opportunity to even see whether it works. You can today signify that the Church of England so loves the status quo that you'd prefer to preserve the status quo before you try something different. Would you like to do that? Would you like to be culturally noted as so resistant to change that when you voted in favour of change, you'd prefer to change it back to the status quo before you've given the change an opportunity? I'm not going to embarrass you and ask you to stand if you'd like to be regarded as a revolutionary, but would you like to be regarded as someone who is prepared to signal that as a church we would like to change and move on? You've heard what could happen in a deanery synod if you adhere and give these rules an opportunity of working. It may not be revolutionary, but it is the way to bring new life. It is said that there will be difficulties recruiting. Well, if there are difficulties recruiting, with all due respect, the answer is not to preserve the status quo and allow the people who are in place to be Miss Havisham-like, covered with cobwebs as the years go by. The answer is to look at why there are not people willing to stand, to make more attractive the deanery synods, which in a moment of humour, we might say they're not exciting. If they're not exciting, then let's do something about it. We will do nothing about it if we preserve the status quo. Let's be mildly revolutionary, and at least for a period, give the new rules the opportunity that they richly deserve. You voted in favour of them. Have the courage of your convictions for at least a period to see whether or not they work. I invite you to resist this proposal. Thank you.
After Deborah McIsaac, I call Zoe, who, I'm sorry, I'm having a senior moment and I can't remember your second name. Thank you.
Good morning. Deborah McIsaac, Salisbury 405. I see Mr. Greenwood is standing, so I'll leave it to him if he is called to remind you of the background to this matter. I think we have to think long and hard before we choose not to support a return to the existing position. Synod, I would remind you that Deanery Synod members are, of course, the electorate for this General Synod. This would bring about a fundamental change in the franchise and the polity of the lay people in the church. And it would be wrong, I think, to do that without at least an opportunity to debate the substance of the matter as suggested by bringing forward a rule change for debate in July 2020. Thank you.
Thank you. After Zoe Hemming, forgive me for forgetting that bit, Zoe, I call the gentleman here in the suit. Have you time? Thank you.
Zoe Hemming, Lichfield 145. With my vicar's head on, just thinking through the options, and actually whichever way we go here, we PCCs are going to have the option to either opt in or out of whichever way we go. I'm thinking in terms of potential conflict. If the default is everybody has to have a break, at least in terms of office, that then makes for potentially far better relationships, where other than a PCC at an APCM choosing to say, oh, we've decided to opt for change, potentially the subtext is because we really don't want you to keep standing. If the default option is we clear the decks out, or we are going to need people who are standing to have a break in terms of office, it removes that element of conflict or potential conflict. And so, Synod, if we keep on doing what we have been doing, we will always get what we have got. Thank you.
After our next speaker, I call Prudence Daly.
Nick Land, York 438. In asking Synod to support this motion, I find myself in unfamiliar territory. Like many of you, I will have taken over as chair of committees or boards of directors or trustees and looked around the table and wondered how many of them were appointed before the Reformation, or at least before decimalisation. And I've reached for that familiar tool, a governance review, and the introduction of term limits. But in doing this, one always needs to be aware of unintended consequences. And I think in this case, in making it a term limit of only 2 terms, we introduce 2 problems. The first one, of course, is that the term limits do not apply to all members of this particular group, and therefore it does change the power dynamic significantly. Now, I know there are clergy who dream about term limits for deanery synods, but actually in many parts of the country, our deanery synods are changing. They are not always now the risible things of the past. Certainly in York, we have put a huge amount of work into making them the thing that drives mission in our local areas. We have not a lay chair, but a lay dean in partnership with the area dean. And we have a deanery leadership team of clergy and lay people alike working together to build partnership in mission across the deanery. I would be being disingenuous if I said it was working perfectly everywhere, but there are many deaneries where deaneries have become real drivers of change. And of course, a 2-term limit cuts straight through this, because really only the most self-confident, self-opinionated, extrovert layperson is likely to step up to be lay dean after serving just 1 term. And as a self-confident, opinionated layperson, I'm aware that other leadership styles are available. And if we have just a term limit of just 2 terms, we really do cut through that leadership team. And it means that the area dean will have a different set of people to work with every single term. And that undermines that partnership. Personally, I could have voted very cheerfully for term limits of 4 terms or even 3 terms. But 2 terms just prevents that development of effective partnership in leadership across our deaneries between area deans and lay leaders within the deanery. So I would ask that we support this, which simply asks for us to have a debate as to what might be a more appropriate way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. After Prudence Daly, I call Michael Stalibas.
Prudence Daly, 376 Oxford. I do very much support what is before us today, and I hope that the Synod will too. And there's 2 particular aspects of this that I want to emphasise. The first is it's already been noted that this would put deanery synods out of sync with other synods where term limits don't apply. But of course, we General Synod members and also the Diocesan Synod members are ex officio members of deanery synods. So if we have term limits, and particularly if we have compulsory term limits, it means that there will be a small group of lay deanery synod members who will not be affected by those term limits while everybody else is. So who's going to end up as the lay chairman, the secretary, the treasurer. It's going to be, you know, us, because we'll be the only people who've got the experience to be, you know, the natural fit for those roles in a majority of cases. So that creates, it's not just a question of disparity, but also, you know, disparity within the organisation itself, which is a problem. Now, I am a lay chairman of the Oxford Deanery. Despite that, and despite the fact that my vicar has just become the area dean, my Central Oxford Church currently has no elected lay members of Deanery Synod. There's me, but I'm ex officio. And that's because nobody wants to do it. Now, I'm hoping that will change at the APCM. But being a member of Deanery Synod, it's not like being a church warden. You know, when the church warden comes to the end of the term, you have to have a church warden. You have to have another church warden. You don't have to have Deanery Synod members. And so I'm afraid that term limits, particularly in situations where there aren't obviously people who could be persuaded to take on that role, will just simply result in vacancies. And so I do hope the Synod will support this. Thank you very much.
After Michael Stalliobas, I call Stuart Fife.
Michael Stalliobas, York 439. I very strongly urge all members of Synod to actually support this reconsideration of the term limit being imposed. We have heard a couple of people saying that we need to reimagine deanery synods. We need to breathe new life into them. All I will say to them is, come to York and see what we have done. We have had a radical reimagining of what deanery synods do and what they are. And the fact that we no longer have lay chairs, but lay deans, is just one of the outcomes of that radical change. And it really has breathed new life into a large proportion, I won't say all, but it is a large proportion of the deaneries within York Diocese. But having worked towards this reimagining of deaneries, I am really concerned that putting a two-term, that is a 6-year limit on elected deanery synod members will actually cut across the new life which we in our diocese are seeing in our deanery synods. Change does not require a term limit. Change in the life of deanery synods requires something much more radical, and we have experienced that and are already benefiting from it. Thank you.
Point of order.
Simon Butler, Southwark 219. Sometimes short debates are good debates. Would you accept a motion for closure after the next speaker?
I would be happy to put that to the Synod. Thank you. Stuart.
Stuart Fife, Carlisle 079. I speak as a rural dean of, I'm the rural dean of Appleby, which is, I understand, the largest and also most sparsely populated deanery in the Church of England. This is a very tricky question, isn't it? It's quite a subtle one on the face of it as to whether we start with the presumption of term limits or start with the presumption of no term limits. And either way, we do get a choice. I want to speak up for the people of my deanery and other deaneries, I suspect, like them, who are deeply underconfident, who are shy, who are instinctively highly reluctant to put themselves forward to serve in any capacity. I find it hard to explain to people not used to these situations how difficult it is to persuade good people to come and serve, let alone to stand for offices like lay chair or secretary or treasurer, and then to think of coming into a place like this where they might serve on General Synod. But I rather think we would be better for hearing more from their voices. I know that I've learned an awful lot from them in the years that I've served as Rural Dean. Now, of course, we could simply amend things locally so that they didn't have to step down after 2 terms. But I can see their faces as I try to explain to them, after years of encouraging them to stand, that they then have to step down. And I also know that they would feel instinctively as failures because the Church of England was wanting to move on and be radical. And here we were, sitting as a little backwater with our small number of people failing again and having to put in the motion that allowed us to opt out. They feel failures far too often. And in Appleby at the moment, as they sit underwater, you can imagine how much they feel this. So my plea is that we consider the voices in these marginalised communities, people who feel deeply underconfident. It's not just in Appleby. I've seen it also in some of the inner city parishes where I've served in the past, for whom they need the encouragement. They need to know that they are valued. And yes, if you want to be radical, and I do have revolutionary credentials, then by all means, opt in to the limit. But for the sake of the weaker brothers and sisters, let's say that we will not impose these as a general rule right across the church.
Point of order.
Simon Butler, Southwark 209. Will you accept a motion for closure on this item?
I give permission for that closure to be moved, so I now put that motion to the Synod. Those in favour of the motion for closure on item 6, please show. Those against the motion for closure, please show. That is carried. So we now ask Clive Scowen to respond. You have up to 10 minutes. Don't make it 5.
Let's go in London 358, Chair. I will do my best. Thank you for a good debate. And despite what was said by one member, I think this is the first time we have had a proper focused debate on this subject in this Synod. I know there was a debate during the revision stage of the measure, but that was very brief and people hadn't given it the thought that they have now. Neither did we have the benefit of the research that the consultation has delivered. And we now can speak in the light of what nearly 1,000 people said. Grateful for the support from many members for what is being proposed. I think what we're bringing forward today actually is very much in the spirit of simplification, which was invoked as a reason for not doing it. Because simplification is really about allowing the maximum flexibility that is reasonably possible. That actually is the spirit that underlies the model rules in Part 9 of the Church Rep Rules, that local parishes can do things as much as possible to suit their own needs. And what we are proposing, I think, does that far better than what is currently in Rule M8. Now, there are several pleas from those who don't want to support this proposal on the basis that we need new life in our deanery synods, we need to reimagine them, and absolutely. I don't know about you, for years my deanery synod was in urgent need of that. It's still not a finished work, although we've made quite a lot of progress. And I actually think giving deanery synods power, as somebody said, with regard to local plans and pastoral reorganisation, the deanery plan, has begun to give deanery synods a greater sense of purpose than they used to have. I'm extremely grateful to Nick Land and Michael Stalebras for their testimony to what's happened in York. and the way that they have been able to create this partnership. I do think they're right to fear that mandatory two-term limits would cut across what they have begun to achieve together. Grateful too to Stuart Fife for reminding us that not everybody who serves on Deanery Synod is like us. A lot of our Deanery Synod members are underconfident, as he said. Not everyone is going to be like Simon Friend, who's going to be able to walk into his first Deanery Synod meeting and be elected chair. People will need at least one term to get used to being there, and then with a two-term limit, they'd only be able to serve one term as chair. So, Chair, I'm aware that I'm not responding to every point that was made in the debate, and that would be difficult to do so. I do think, though, that we do have to recognise that at deanery level, actually the presence of all the licensed clergy is really important to the functioning of the synod, and actually imposing term limits on them would make no sense at all. But if you do have limits for the laity and not for the clergy, you do get this unbalance. I think probably the only other thing that I need to do is to record my thanks, particularly to Jenny Jacobs, whose job it was to wade through 928 responses, record what people said in their qualitative response, and analyze the figures. It was the most enormous Herculean task, and strange as it may seem, it wasn't the only job she had. So I think we really ought to record our thanks to her. Finally, Chair, I hope you will all support this resolution overwhelmingly, and I particularly plead to any clergy or bishops who are thinking, oh, this is a lay matter, I'm not going to vote. Please, we need you to support the laity in achieving what they want to achieve. And so please do not feel disqualified in any way from voting on this proposal. Thank you.
So I now put point of order.
Madam Chairman, Graham Caskey, Oxford 375. Purely on the principle that this item cannot pass each House by simple majority today, it is unlikely to pass each House by 2/3 in July, I would like to propose a vote by Houses on this item of business.
I am content to accept that proposal, so I order... Oh, I need to see 25 members standing. I beg your pardon. Do I see... I do see 25 members standing. You can sit down again. Therefore, I am content, because you want it to happen, to accept that proposal, and I order a count by Houses.
I am now about to ring the bell to warn members that the counted vote is to take place. 2 minutes after it ceases, the counted vote will begin.
Synod, the motion before us is that this Synod request the Business Committee to introduce a draft Church Representation Rules (Amendment) resolution at the July 2020 group of sessions to give effect to the recommendations at paragraph 22 of GS 2154. This is a counted vote by houses. Those in favour should press 1. Those against should press 2. Those who wish to record an abstention should press 3.
The voting period is now open and will end in 1 minute. The voting period will end in 15 seconds. The voting period has now ended.
The voting is as follows. The House of Bishops in favour 14, against 6, recorded abstentions 1. The House of Clergy in favour 66, against 31, recorded abstentions 3. The House of Laity in favour 128, against 14, recorded abstentions 2. So in favour there is 208, against 51, and recorded abstentions 6. So the motion at item 6 is passed. That's the end of item 6 and business for this morning. We can go to lunch a little early. We reconvene at 2:30 this afternoon.